Welcome to our Intro to Regen Agriculture workshop this evening. We're a community environment centre based in the town of Gawler, just outside of Adelaide, but I think we've got attendees from all over the place tonight, so welcome on board. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and for me that's the land of the Gawler people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us this evening. So we've got three speakers tonight. We've got Dick Richardson from Grazing Naturally, Graham Brookman from the Food Forest, and Jared Murray from Green Living Permaculture. So what I'll do is I'll introduce each speaker. They'll each speak for 10 to 15 minutes. And then at the end of that time, we can have questions and a bit of panel discussion. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Dick Richardson of Grazing Naturally. And Dick is an internationally recognised leader in the practice of natural grazing to improve soil depth and health, water retention, increase biodiversity and animal production. So I will hand you over to Dick now.
All right, good evening, everyone. Not sure where you're up to with your numbers now, but it's actually quite an interesting opportunity to be here together doing this. It's not often that I have a shared forum with people on a webinar, so that's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much. So, Kathy, first of all, you asked me to talk a little bit about what regenerative ag is and what it's all about. It's sort of a new buzzword and a big new excitement, really, I suppose, is the best place to start. It's not at all structured. It's not at all aligned in any way and defined even. I know there are sort of 6 basic principles that are brought into by people saying that these are the basic principles of regenerative ag. However, regenerative ag's but likely to or potentially going to be just a fad that sort of passes through and creates a lot of shift without really ever getting defined or pulling out different words or structure. Now, I personally totally dislike the word regenerative. I couldn't stand the idea and refused to be put in the regenerative mob in any way for very many years until these fellas from the Healthy Soils Australia, they're really worth looking up, till Healthy Soils Australia sort of cornered me and said, Dick, we need you to make sure we add your name to regenerative ag. Now, I explained why I didn't want to do it. In places like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the US, anything that is is bringing you back to a chosen date and a style and a specific way that a thing must have looked. And therefore, I have never felt comfortable with doing that. But in this case, they've talked me into getting involved by saying it's about regenerating soil life and health. It's nothing to do with saying that on Captain Cook Day, for example, was how Australia must look again. So we're going to regenerate it to Captain Cook Day or something like that. So for me now, I'm a bit more easy with this thing and I am involved with it. However, there's some standalone sort of issues happening here. First of all, regenerative ag is almost becoming regenerative cropping. Very few of us in the grazing world are really being heard in this regenerative world. It's mostly even just tripping straight into being about cropping and the regenerating of soils through cropping. So much so that it's becoming a massive expenditure to people using a lot of polypasture stuff, planting it and growing them, replacing all their chemicals with now natural fertilizers and heaps of seed and stuff going into the country and becoming, in my view, highly unsustainable because of the expenditure and the low return out of what people are doing with it. It's not that it's written up to be that way. It's just that people don't tend to use and utilize and turn into cash what they've been doing. So I'm a bit negative about the whole viewpoint of this expenditure happening, but at the same time, I'm still very much involved with regenerative ag, but from a grazing perspective. So I can help people with cropping, I do to a degree, but again, you would get a different perspective from me than you would with from most hyperventilating, overexcited about getting all these polypastures all at great expense. So regenerative ag for me is about grazing in a fashion using animals, which then will build soil structure, will generate soil structure. So the word re doesn't even feature in what I do. It's generating soil structure. I'm not driving for increasing soil life. I'm not driving for increasing any of that, because once I create structure to happen, everything that will happen needs to potentially happen in that soil. And it's going to define which way it goes into which kind of ecosystems present there by what methods of management you utilize. If you're going to be growing pastures, you're going to be growing fruit, you're going to be growing vegetables, you're going to be growing livestock, well, you're going to end up with a different ecosystem in that soil. Therefore, the structure being evolved or generated in there will then create a void or resource excesses, which would then fill up with organisms which are associated with that particular function. So one principle of nature, which I base a lot of my work on, is that form will always follow function. So in my case, working mostly in the grazing world, the function really is grazing, in which case the form of that ecosystem will come out in an ecological community which is going to be grazing orientated. Okay, it's not going to come out in a decomposition orientated or an oxidation orientated ecosystem. It's going to come out as a grazing orientated ecosystem. So the whole enterprise of grazing is very, very simple one, actually. All it is gathering a bit of moisture out of the soil, getting some sunlight energy, some carbon out of the atmosphere during the day, some oxygen out of the atmosphere at night, because everybody must remember plants breathe in oxygen at night, and getting that all together into carbohydrates and protein strings, which we then can ingest through animals and put through the digestion pathway. This digestion pathway is a way, it's at the moment, it's really defined in science as decomposition, but it's not, because what comes out of a digestion outcome is very different to what comes out of a decomposition outcome. What you're ending up with is ionized elements, and you're ending up with food which is highly utilizable by further organisms in the ingestion game. So it's turning this feed that you grow into dung and urine, and then selling the byproducts is what it's about. It's not about creating some kind of a decomposition setup. A decomposition setup is a forest-style ecosystem. They're much more ancient ecosystems where organic matter gets dropped down and all pushed down to soil surface, and it decomposes at soil surface. High percentage of it does. You will hear later about permaculture. That's a major amount of permaculture is about putting lots of litter and mulch down at soil surface to break down, which is a woodland style ecosystem. I'm not sure who else you'll hear about tonight about that, but a grazing ecosystem is quite different to that. A grazing ecosystem is one where most of what is grown goes through an animal's gut. Most of the organisms involved are ingesters. So you do not get lignin ingesters. Lignin is broken down mostly, so a woodland scenario is broken down external to the organism's body using acids and then only being able to ingest anything. Whereas the grazing ecosystem is driven by ingestion and fermentation. All the insects involved in the grazing ecosystem, including animal and all the animal kingdom basically, but the insects, etc., have taken the role of carbon cycling over from the old fungal saprotrophs that did it in a woodland ecosystem. So in a woodland ecosystem, the saprotrophs, the fungal saprotrophs, did most of the carbon cycling. They did it external to their bodies using acids, and they broke down that material. So you ended up with soils that were relatively loose. I wouldn't call them soils. I would call them more like potting mixture, which is loose. You can push your hand into it. And if I took a handful of a spadeful and I put it in water overnight, you'd get all the sort of dry, dead material of plants, etc., float to the surface, and then you'd get a little bit of silt lie down at the bottom. The grazing ecosystem is a higher order ecosystem, in other words, more recently evolved, and your saprotrophs have given up the decomposition game and have moved into transport of minerals, nutrients, energy, etc. It's still a very balanced bacterial fungal community. It's wrong to say it's a bacterial-driven community. It's a balanced one with single-cell fungi and these massive mycorrhizal fungal networks, which are all saprotrophs, but to do the trading. They no longer do any breakdown. So what's happened is you've moved into a whole plethora of organisms that actually digest and in that way ferment and break up the plant matter to make it available for another one. So we end up with soils in that grazing ecosystem, which are X of animals. In other words, all the mineral nutrient and that has mostly come out of the inside of an animal. And then you end up with the high amount of carbon being pushed into the soils through what's called by Christine Jones anyway, who's in the district at the moment, the liquid carbon pathway. In other words, root exudates being released by the plant roots into the soil. This feeds organisms there who then build glomalins, etc., and create humus compounds. So this is a very opposite to a decomposition pathway. This is a composition pathway where humus compounds are put together, which hold soil apart and hold them together. They have the ability to hold water, obviously. They can trade in cations and anions. So they're a whole two-way movement type of compound, but they hold soil particles together and apart. So if you went and dug a grazing ecosystem soil out, a square of a spade, you'd actually have to lift that out. You'd have to break the roots off that are going into the ground, and then you'd be able to lift it up. And the leaves would hang all the roots off the bottom of it, and you'd be able to see soil stuck to them. And that big mass of soil you'd bring up, you could then go and put in a beaker of water overnight, and it would soak the water up into it, and you'd get a very little of it actually being loose enough to break up and go into the bottom of that tub of water and lie there in a silt layer. So you'll see the exact opposite of a potting soil type of soil. These are structured soils which have lots of space in them for organisms to live and breathe and do their things and breed and all the rest of it and catch water and hold water. So it's about regenerating that structure, and in my view, the generation of that structure means we're being able to repair our water cycle, because the water cycle is having our biggest trouble at the moment. So, right, having said all of that, then that first principle is that form will always follow function. If you like, you could use Jan Smuts' definition of that, which is nature works in patterns and wholes instead. And that would mean that the whole is defined by the patterns, or in this case, the functions that drive the development of that form. And in my case, I'm working mostly with grazing management, right? So when I'm looking at this now, I have to somehow get these animals to operate in a constructive manner. So one of the principles we use is one which is, I'm credited for this one, which change equals change. In other words, if I want biodiverse outcomes, I've got to have biodiverse activities. So we have extreme variation in what we do. We'll have opposite extremes from grazing plants frequently, repetitively, and intensely. I call them frequent, repetitive, intensive grazers, where we will regraze plants at about 4 to 5 leaves and keep them in their vegetative state with high sugar flows. But we have an opposite event occurring also for those same paddocks, which we call a Sabbath event, where we give a paddock a full 12 months off. So those are our two extreme events that gives us as much change in how we practice or deal with each paddock. That gives us basically a 7-year variation in how we treat paddocks. So that's one of our big ones. Another principle, of course, throughout it is matching stocking rate to carrying capacity. We do teach some very simple methods to do that. And we have a large part of this whole setup is about keeping animals together to do this. However, Grazing Naturally tries to avoid massive stock densities. I know massive stock densities are a huge excitement for everyone, but they create too much compaction, very much stress on animal lives, and huge amounts of that stress ends up in low animal performance. Anyway, so giving us the ability to get better animal performance while we achieve this. So we can actually frequently, repetitively, intensively graze paddocks without having a negative movement if we keep them in that 4 to 6 leaf stage. The big secret with ecological shift in grazing animals is trying to avoid having your plants go into a reproductive stage all the time. So we'll do this for 3 or 4 years. They won't be allowed into a reproductive stage. Then we'll have, for the next 2 or 3 years, they would have been allowed to. We Sabbath after we've priority grazed, keeping plants short and active, and that allows us to keep these plants in this highly sugar flow state. The reason we don't want to keep as much of it active as we can is A, plants going reproductive will use 4 times the water that they will use when they're vegetative. B, we keep sugar flows going. If plants become reproductive, nearly all plants become reproductive, they will stop producing sugars. And really most of our plant-based liquid carbon going to the soil comes out of either a forb or a grass. Very little of it comes out of trees. There are some higher order trees that do it, but not a lot of them. And so that's the drive behind Grazing Naturally, to achieve soil growth using variations of grazing management, frequency, repetitive and intensity changing with the grazing management, and keeping plants healthy and going for a longer time. We then have our Sabbath paddocks, which give us a year off, chance to set seed, and all the forbs, shrubs, and trees get a chance to replace themselves. We're getting some pretty good results out of this in terms of carbon, really good ecological outcomes, some good financial outcomes, and people are really enjoying it because of its simplicity. Stick down your questions and send them in. We'd love to talk a little bit more. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I would like to introduce everyone to Graham Brookman, our next speaker. So Graham is a qualified horticulturalist, teacher, permaculture designer, and he's the inaugural chairman of the Adelaide Showground Farmers Market, and long-serving Gawler Environment Centre committee member and past chair. The Food Forest is a permaculture farm and learning centre developed by Anna Marie and Graham and their children, Tom and Nikki. So thanks very much, Graham.
All righty. So regenerative agriculture, this is our little case study. And I guess I'd like to say that regenerative agriculture is nothing new. In fact, it's pretty old. And it's been going for millennia, and I can't actually read my notes here because, oh yes, I can now. The term organic was probably the first agriculture to really be identified as relying on natural organisms and minerals rather than industrial products. And that was a term chosen by old Albert Howard in India in the 1930s. It's called organic because it represents a system like organs of our body that must work together to create a whole being. And then we've got dear old Lady Eve Balfour, and she actually gave a bit of ground. Organic was very, very strict, and it remains strict. But she weakened a bit towards the end and called it sustainable agriculture. And as founder of the Soil Association, she was very influential. But much later along came Bob Regenerative Rodale of the Rodale Foundation. And it was in the 1980s, really, when the Rodale Foundation in North America decided it wanted to discriminate itself from organic, though they had always been organic, in that he wanted to emphasise its capacity to regenerate itself when disturbed. He characterised it as having diversity, resilience, permanence, purity, and basic improvement. So that was his thought, and that's regen from day one. At the same time, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren at the University of Tasmania were defining permanent agriculture, which quickly morphed into permanent culture, or permaculture, which was based on a design system for creating sustainable occupation of the planet by humans. And it claimed to encompass all the domains of human endeavour. Permaculture doesn't require any leaps of faith, and the design system can be learned very quickly, but not tonight, folks. And then in South Africa, Alan Savory was beavering away, accumulating the deep understanding of ecosystems, grazing strategies, and agricultural decision-making that led to holistic management, which focuses on water and nutrient cycles. And Dick's already got into some of the incredible intricacies of it through the grazing patterns and so forth. But really, holistic management really hit the public in 2013 during a TED talk. All these three systems share many of the same values and techniques, and I've laid a few of them out there. We chose permaculture as a philosophy that embraced global, biological, built and human systems and provided a strong design methodology. It includes many of these different concepts and strategies you've got on the screen at the moment. But let's look at our case study finally. I'd returned from a working holiday overseas which looked at food production and cultures more generally, and most importantly had met Anna Marie on the way, and we teamed up. This is the logo we devised for our farm, and it says it all. We wanted a piece of land which had abundance and a complex ecology with native and exotic species, sort of a bit like the lamb lying down with the lion, but carefully managed by people who took care of the earth and each other. So the stakeholders and decision makers in this venture were our immediate family, but there were plenty of other people who have contributed huge amounts of energy and thought and ideas into the place as a demo of sustainable planning and management. So then what we have to answer, what and who did we have to create this paradise that we wanted in South Australia? We had some skills. We both studied agriculture. We were broke, but we both obtained full-time work pretty quickly with a view to buying a car. That was a bit of a start. And it looked like we might buy 28 acres of land on the alluvial floodflats just west of Gawler, with potential to tap into the groundwater and perhaps the seasonal river for irrigation. The soil that we bought looked so good, but it actually had less than 1% carbon, and it had a massive hard pan. So we had the job ahead of us. So the context of the project was that we were both happy to work in education and live in rental accommodation while we set up the property. We went through a decision-making process to choose a piece of land, and we bought that block on the south bank of the Gawler River, the mighty Gawler River, as we call it in Gawler. And we got a neighbour to share farm the land while we built up a few ideas and resources. We fleshed out a mission statement to make the seem a bit real, because it was just a bare windswept block with not a tree on it. We wanted to demonstrate that land can be managed environmentally sustainably and produce healthy food and a healthy income. We wanted to share the information that we learned on the way, and we wanted to create a rich and beautiful place to live, work and have our children. And they have worked out pretty well as children go. Now, essential production, I think this means keeping a roof over your head, staying sane and achieving some of your goals. As a dryland block, the land we'd found would produce just a few $1,000s from grain, hay and a few sheep. So planting deep-rooted perennial species and, planning that irrigation would be employed to intensify productivity enabled us to qualify for primary produce status. We grew gherkins commercially, which sounds a bit weird. 60 rows of gherkins, 60 metres each bloody row. Oh God, we hated it. But we planted steadily, planted both gherkins and also planted pistachios and grafted them for long-term income. Didn't actually go anywhere. Anyway, the neighbours eventually did tell us that they'd like to move, and after a permaculture design course with Bill Mollison, we designed the whole property, including some wonderful fixed assets, a beautiful old barn, a shed, 3-phase power. We moved there in '86 and have been diversifying frantically ever since. So the resources that we have now. Obviously, the pistachio enterprise. So organic pistachios are pretty rare in Australia, and so that was our first kind of big bet. And there's about 150 other varieties of fruits, nuts, and veggies, and then you've got a small market garden, which gives us some steady income through the year. A really good food processing shed that enables us to value add to all sorts of different foods that come off the place. Photovoltaics that provide most of our power, a composting system that handles all of our waste and really helps us to cycle stuff, and I guess gets back to the regenerative kind of label pretty nicely. So the property is a lot drier and saltier than it was, and shade has become a problem. We really need lots of it. Anyway, the red lines are our boundaries, and you can see the Gawler River running along the northern boundary. It's a funny shaped block on the right, and then a nice almost rectangular block to the west. This shot brings you closer to the home, which functions as 2 autonomous homes, and the farmyard where we have the learning centre and accommodation for students and interns. So it's quite a decent lump of the place taken up by that sort of what we in permaculture would call zone 1 and 2. They're very intensive zones that soak up a lot of water and nutrients and power and so forth. I want to explain some of the other resources and how we use them, starting with the more physical ones. We've got a big water harvesting and filtration setup, which gives us a reliable irrigation system, some novel fencing that keeps the place rabbit-free and part fox-proof. We have sheep and geese to control pasture in the orchards, and they're rotated through 9 paddocks. I know it's not 100, but anyway, 9's about the best we could do with our setup. A little nursery and some major biodiversity areas where we've kind of borrowed the whole of the Gawler River riparian zone to be an extension of our property for biodiversity purposes. Now for some equally important things, the economic and social resources. As a learning centre, part of our mission to share information, and it's an important source of income. And then we've got very good access to metropolitan markets, including the Adelaide Showground Farmers Market, which is terribly important to our economic success. And then social, we've got 5 long-term employees and a strong set of networks, both professional and social. And we did actually go right back to Albert Howard and certified organic, and that gives us not only a lot of satisfaction, but also a nice premium. Kathy, I'm aware that I'm running out of time. Now, management techniques that probably everyone's really wanting to be here for in a permaculture system. I'm not going to go through all of the 12 design principles, but there are a few bits and pieces I want to talk about. Sun, it's abundant free energy for making food and electricity, and we can do most things using electricity today. We really don't need to be burning all these fossil fuels. Food forest, well, that looks like a little food forest on the right there. And they are remarkable things that soak up just about all the light that falls on them and create microclimates within the actual forest that enable us to grow a very great diversity of foods. And every even small backyard block can really have one. We're now getting too much sun in the summer, and that can be regulated by shade structures and so forth, as well as sunscreen sprays. So we don't mind manipulating things in permaculture. That's quite okay. And one of those that we would include would be giving animals shade. Now, this is really Dick's territory, but soil, get it tested and find out what's in it. it's important for both the plants and the animals, and you really do need the right mixture. You have to replace the nutrients that are exported in grain, fruit, sheep and so forth. There's no magic kind of way of magicking elements out of fresh air, so it does have to be found. Compost's a great way of completing that cycle because it brings that waste back into the system. Microbes obviously are great arbiters in all of this, and much soil carbon is just dead microbes, so that gives a lot of stability. We've found ash is a very good concentrated fertiliser, just ordinary old wood ash. Manure obviously can be used to produce biogas as well as being a useful fertiliser, and urine is absolutely phenomenal in terms of its fertiliser capacity. If we just took the human manure and urine coming through our sewers, 85% of the nutrients, the stable nutrients, could be captured, and that's being done in Canada as we speak. We have a composting toilet, and man, is that good. As far as water is concerned, we don't have any runoff. It's a classic Mediterranean climate. It's been steadily reducing since we started farming. We started with 450 mils and we're lucky to get 300 nowadays. We get most of our water from a stormwater drain that enters the Gawler River channel next to the property, and we can pump that into a settling pond from which it goes through fine filters into an aquifer, and that then can be pumped up for irrigation. So we're kind of using the aquifer as our dam, and that's a little diagram to kind of help you understand what the hell we're doing. In terms of crops and pastures, we can't graze like the graziers where you actually have enough rainfall and the right species to be able to have animals tearing around grazing all the time. So we're pretty much limited to annual crops with our area. So much of the farm is under agroforestry with fodder trees, windbreaks, biodiversity blocks and so forth, which gives us a bit of grazing, but we also make quite a lot of hay, and that helps us with tucker for the animals in bad parts of the year. Geese and sheep convert pasture and weeds into manure and meat. Our geese probably were pilgrims, but either way, they're good walkers, produce good carcasses, and 30-odd breeders produce about 100 young for slaughter annually. They really love grass and have kept the creeping weeds off our property. They need water just to drink and wash their faces. They're completely compatible with the sheep, who are responsible for broad leaf, weed and pasture control.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for your very excellent presentation. So now I would like to introduce everyone to Jared Murray from Green Living Permaculture. So Jared is the founder of Green Living Permaculture, a company which provides regenerative agricultural advice and services based on permaculture design systems. He specialises in the improvement and building of healthy soils to produce better quality, nutrient-dense food and improved plant resilience to a changing climate. So I will just hand over now to Jared.
Thanks for the introduction, Kathy. You've pretty much covered it all in the first slide, so I'll pretty much work up in the Clare Valley exclusively now, and spend a fair amount of time doing some landscape design and implementing these designs. Pretty much the designs are based on the permaculture principles, which I did a permaculture design course with Graham down there at the Food Forest some years back, and I thoroughly recommend it. It's fantastic. Yeah, I use a wide variety of different practices, I suppose. As Graham and Dick both mentioned, there's many different ways to skin cats, and it's a very, very fluid sort of a word, regenerative agriculture. So it encompasses a lot of different areas. At the moment, I'm working on a few different projects, and it's pretty hard to try to single one of them out. So there's a 12-acre demonstration site in Watervale, which is basically a vertically integrated permaculture-based farm, which rolls into a restaurant and a hotel business. So all the food basically goes to the hotel. There's also a 5-acre property in Mentaro that I'm working on. I do restaurant kitchen gardens in Mount Barker, Auburn and Watervale. I also do garden facilitation as part of the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden program at a couple of schools. And yeah, more and more people and vignerons are very interested in what they can do that can perhaps make their vineyards a little bit more resilient. As Graham mentioned, the climate's getting drier and hotter, and so I've been doing a little bit more work with those people, just in terms of trying to improve some soil health and get some resilience with the vineyards. We own vineyard for about 18 years, so I've had a bit of experience there too. And obviously property design and water harvesting up here, there's a lot of properties large properties are getting broken up into smaller ones, and a lot of people are coming from the city into the country and realising that they've got this land but are not quite sure what the possibilities are. So it's a matter of sitting down and unpacking a few ideas with the people and working out what's important to them and what their visions might be, and trying to come up with some solutions for them. So that's what I'm on to now. So I guess today I thought I might just change it a little bit and talk about a few of the different techniques that I kind of use up here, again with a view to the fact that most of the stuff we do is quite small and intensive, and in general with a lot of intensive or organic growing as it is, you kind of want to do it intensively because it is high on the labour energy side of things. So on the left-hand side is a picture of an area which is 900 square metres, which we created for a small market garden. 3 years later, you see the couple of slides on the right-hand side there, just to what the garden looks like now. And really, that was pretty much the start of that, was through using some techniques which would cover crops, and breaking up the hard pan, improving the structure of the soil, breaking up the hard pan and creating some raised beds. I call them the perma beds because basically once you've made them, you kind of, the principle is not to destroy the structure of the soil anymore. So you just build up the quality of the soil and maintain it with minimal cultivation after that. And so it's never, 3 years later, it's never been cultivated other than with a broad fork. So seems to work quite well. Some other things that I use, and I think Graham mentioned it before, were the keyline principles, which is effectively a tool, man. I don't want to get into it too much, but it's basically a way of improving water harvesting and water catchment on your property. Basically trying to store as much water as you can without runoff. So on the left-hand side, that's a photo of a small area that was ripped using a biodynamic plough developed with Alex Podolinsky by Mike Fix, which was used just in autumn. On the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of the same pasture. You'll see that's early summer. It's holding, the cultivation is obviously holding more water in there because the water on the top sort of left-hand side of it, you'll see where it's a bit drier, the grass, there's a definite yellowing of the grass. That's where the keyline work was not done. Where it has been done, you'll see a plethora of different grasses coming through and definitely holding on to the water a bit longer. Plants are a bit more resilient, but that's a short-term thing. some of the other things which Graham mentioned is composting. So on in these smaller areas where you obviously can't run a lot of animals, compost is a very important, I guess, product in the system. And so some of the things which I'm trialing at the moment are things like Johnson C bioreactors, which are basically, we had a whole heap of those, the ash trees at the front of this property, which, you know, bit of a fire hazard, and they were on the road verge. So they got cut down, and we opportunistically chopped them up, shredded them, and thought being a white soft wood would give them a go in creating some bioreactors. So the intention of the Johnson C method is to create a more fungally dominated compost. And then obviously we do other types of compost, just the traditional hot composting method. Again, this is mostly scraps from the restaurant, as well as products, biomass from the vegetable garden and anything else in the farm. And yeah, basically just do traditional composting there to create a decent product. So I'll put two products lined on the right hand side. There's a couple of products there. One on the left is a commercial product. A bit hard to tell from the photo, but it's a lot more coarser. Obviously, commercial products, they spit them out in, you know, 6 or 8 weeks sort of thing. Enough most of the time you receive them and they're pretty warm still. They're still cooking. So, you know, that the idea is, I guess, quality is better over quantity, and you can't beat the attention and care that you put into making your own compost. Really, that gives you the best results on anything you grow, really. In terms of ground remediation work, so I do a bit of stuff in vineyards and on some paddocks. That's the plough I mentioned. It's a bit like a human plough, very similar. This one here, you can seed and subsoil all in the one go. It's pretty useful in vineyard situations where there's always a hard pan. And I've also found it fairly useful in some trials in paddocks, but cultivation is definitely not something that I recommend. You do it with the intention of trying to improve the soil structure, but it's definitely not. It's a powerful tool that needs some mindful balance and consideration before you do it, that's for sure. But yeah, the results can be good. So on the left hand side there, this was taken, you know, in the middle of summer there, just a couple of months ago really. You see the soil's quite laminated. It's clay. It's quite a laminated material, pretty compacted. The fork only went down maybe 50 centimetres, and then, you know, that's not too far away. That's about 8 foot away. That's the same thing in the fork. Once the treatment's done, that's, you know, you've relieved the compaction. You've got good water infiltration. You've got a good structure to the soil. So, you know, that paddock there is pretty much ready to do other horticulture on it. So we'll be putting orchards and probably more vegetables in there. And that's pretty much it for me. So if you need any more questions, I don't have any Facebook or anything like that, but Hotmail email address there and a phone number. This is pretty much how it is for me. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jared. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. What I might do is, if you guys have got any questions that you want to ask each other as well, then please feel free while people are typing away.
There were just a couple of comments that I wrote down. The Grazing Naturally method is quite different to the holistic management plan grazing, Graham. So with that, 9 paddocks are more than adequate to achieve heaps of outcomes with the Grazing Naturally method, which you wouldn't get with holistic plan grazing. As you would know already, I used to teach holistic land grazing and holistic management, but I don't do that anymore because I've had to work out ways to do more practical outcomes. And Graham, you're a right feeding stock, mate. If you've got extra feed growth in the growing season like we do, you and I in similar sort of country, you've got to make use of that, and you can keep it youthful in that little 3-week spell of growth that we get. We can sort of keep it youthful by cutting and making silage even, and just getting it off and let the growth regrow and keep it nice and soil productive. At the same time, use it to keep us going later on. So that's good, very good.
So in terms of letting stuff go right through to hay, are you saying that I could have done quite a bit better had I grazed it a few times before that?
Yeah, that's right, Graham. Or even cut it earlier and put it into silage, while you don't have quite the sunlight to cure a good hay. I think one of the mistakes that we've been led to do by misunderstanding how plants operate and grow is that we let things go to seed, and that rips a whole lot of energy and nutrient out of the soil. If we have to at some stage let that happen, obviously, but if we can do that, say 4 or 5 out of 7 years and keep them nice and flush and short, then you'll get more soil growth out of it. And if you're feeding them back on the same paddocks, well, you're getting that energized dung and urine that both you and Jared were referring to. You're better off than letting it all go to seed and rip a whole lot of sulfur, for example, silica, and all these things that go out of it when it goes to seed.
So in that rest year or so that you were talking about, is the concept there that you would be letting a lot of the plants go to seed and to sort of regenerate from seed as part of that cycle?
That's right. Yeah, we get it. It's an opportunity for the seed-eating birds to have a run. It's an opportunity for all your more woody plants that are generally slower growing than grasses and forbs to get a regrowth on and replace some of the browse that we lose from those more frequent repetitive grazes. And we also have an opportunity there for that seed production for regeneration into the future, especially for the annuals,
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I do have one question from John Butler, and the question is to everyone. So he would like to know, would it be fair to characterise regenerative grazing as permaculture for grasslands? Anyone want to have a crack at that?
And if you like, I would just say I wish that was what it would normally be, but I'm afraid most grazing is sort of, broad scale, not paying attention enough to the detail, which is what I love so much about permaculture. Is it's all about detail and letting the small person make more expression in your landscape. But if you were able to put your grazing management with the Grazing Naturally method, for example, into the smaller spaces and get that detail, then I believe, yes, you would have permaculture in a grazing grassland sort of picture. So I like that statement.
Yeah, might be onto something there, John.
I was just thinking that we have knocked down a lot of native scrub, and sort of a lot of our woodlands have been reduced to flat bare paddocks, and so whilst it may be somewhat tempting to just take that as a signal from our ancestors that should remain grassland, I would make the case that agroforestry, whether that be actually growing trees for wood or whether it be merely growing a whole lot of shrubs and more woody stuff, would probably be quite nice as far as the average dorper was concerned, and the cattle wouldn't mind it either. I think we haven't really explored that business of agroforestry terribly thoroughly, and a lot of it's to do with fencing, which is expensive, but I think it would be great to go back to something that is a bit more like a woodland.
Okay, Annie P would like to know where she can read more about Dick's recommendations and grazing management. Dick, would you like to give a bit of a plug for some of your resources?
Yeah, that's a wonderful opportunity to talk about a little bit, Kathy. If I just put, I'll put my telephone number on there if you like. But if you go onto my website, I've actually got quite a flash website for an old-fashioned type fella who didn't use what's that thing called? You guys are using PowerPoint. I'm normally a drawer on a board and that sort of thing. So I've actually got quite a flash website, and there's some pretty good resources on it. And that's just the grazingnaturally.com.au. You'll find it on there. There's forage assessment tools, all the rest of it. And if you just drop an email to us and you say you were on this particular show, I'm quite happy to send you some notes, which are the method notes, which explain the thinking behind it and how the ecosystem operates and how we manage for it. So yeah, I'd love to be engaged more. So just get hold of us. I'm available. Grazingnaturally.com.au, I think it is.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone, all our presenters for attending, and yes, everyone for tuning in to listen. We are able to put you in touch with any of the presenters that you would like to get further information from. So please feel free to get in contact with us at Gawler Environment Centre. I'll also send out a short survey to everyone who registered about the webinar. I can also, pass on any questions that you might have in response to that. So thank you very much to everyone for attending, and brought to you tonight by Gawler Environment Centre. And thanks very much to Dick from Grazing Naturally, to Graham from the Food Forest, and to Jared from Green Living Permaculture.